Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to talk about the Quranic contribution of Ustaz Amin Ahsan Islahi. Ustaz Amin Ahsan Islahi, as some of you might be knowing, was a protege of Ustaz Hamiduddin Farahi, one of the most distinguished and illustrious Quranic scholars of the subcontinent. Ustaz Hamiduddin Farahi died in 1930, and for the last 5 years of his life, Ustaz Amin Ahsan Islahi was his student, and he remained with him like a shadow, and he studied the Quran with him and some other disciplines as well. But his outstanding contribution besides in various fields is in Quranic studies, in which he built upon the heritage which was left by Ustaz Hamiduddin Farahi. And he wrote a 9-volume tafsir or exegesis of the Quran, which is called Quran, and it is a complete and a masterful tafsir of the Quran. Ustaz Hamiduddin Farahi was not able to complete the tafsir that he had in mind, so he wrote introduction to his tafsir by the name of Nizam al-Quran, and he also wrote the tafsirs of 14 surahs of the Quran, which have been published. Some other surahs were also written by him, their exegesis, but they were not published in his own lifetime, and later on they were published. But it was left to his disciple and pupil, Ustaz Amin Ahsan Islahi, to complete the work that he had left unfinished. And Ustaz Amin Ahsan Islahi not only was able to finish the work, but I think in all due respect and in all due proportion, he made many original contributions to the thought of his mentor. So today we are going to talk about his Quranic contribution. When I say his Quranic contribution, of course, he has made significant contributions in other areas of Islamic studies as well. He has written profusely, and he has authored books on numerous subjects besides the Quran. They include hadith, they include fiqh. Of course, he has taught a number of students throughout his life. Various batches have been taught by him. He was born in Azamgarh in 1904, and he passed away in Pakistan, Lahore, in 1997. So he lived to the ripe old age of 93, and he had the distinguishing trait, I would say, of being a prominent scholar of this subcontinent, and he had his role in India as well, and of course played a significant role in Pakistan as far as religious studies are concerned. When he was in India, he was teaching at the Madrasatul Islah, where he himself was enrolled as a student many years ago. So he graduated from Madrasatul Islah in traditional disciplines, and as I said, in the last 5 years of his life, from 1925 to 1930, he had the unique honor of being a very special student of Ustaz Hamiduddin Farahi. And he actually worked not only as a student, but he was also sent by Ustaz Hamiduddin Farahi as to various countries to collect money for the madrasa, and as a result, also contribute significantly for the well-being of the rest of the students. Very earlier on in life, when Ustaz Abul Ala Maududi, in the earlier life of Ustaz Amin Ahsan Islahi, so very earlier on, he joined the party created or established by Ustaz Abul Ala Maududi, which is famously called the Jamaat-e-Islami, which was founded in 1940. And Ustaz Amin Ahsan Islahi actually shifted over to Pathankot, and it was there that this party was founded. And he remained with Ustaz Maududi for almost 17 years, and it was not until 1957 that he resigned due to some principles, on the basis of some principles. But during these 17 years, he traveled the length and breadth of Pakistan to deliver khutbahs and to teach people and to be part of various instructional courses. In 1957, when he ultimately left the Jamaat, it was now that he got the chance to concentrate on the Quranic thought of his mentor, Ustaz Hamiduddin Farahi, and it was at this time, at this juncture, that he started off his tafsir, Quran, and it took about 22 to 23 years, and it was around about August 1980 that this tafsir was finished. And he, of course, was able to live after that. He passed away in 1997. So after completing his tafsir, he was also able to give lectures on the principles of tafsir. He also gave lectures on hadith interpretation. He gave lectures on philosophy. And in the final 3 or 4 years, he became very ill, actually, and was confined to the bed. And it was in the last 3 years when he was totally incapacitated and he could not teach. So on 15th of December, 1997, he passed away. So this was a very brief introduction to his personality and his background and how he was closely related to Ustaz Hamiduddin Farahi. So I'm going to talk about some of his significant contributions regarding the Quranic thought and regarding the interpretation of the Quran. The first and foremost contribution that he made, which is an extension of the thought of his own mentor, Ustaz Hamiduddin Farahi, is that he showed that as far as the Quran is concerned, it is a text which has a single interpretation. And he went on to show that just as Ustaz Hamiduddin Farahi had said, Al-Qur'anu la yahtamilu illa ta'wilan wahida, that the Quran can only have one interpretation, which means that the Quranic meanings can only be one. I mean, there cannot be diverse meanings. You cannot interpret different meanings from the same verse. When the Almighty is conveying a message, it is a well-grounded, definite, and a well-thought-of message, and each verse has a singular meaning. And it is only because of our own shortcomings that we have these differences in engaging or understanding a Quranic verse. But as far as the language is concerned, as far as the speaker is concerned, who obviously is God, his purport was to convey a single meaning. And throughout his tafsir to the Quran, actually, he showed this to a great extent. And wherever he was not able to understand a particular verse, he actually very, very frankly admitted that his own opinion in this case still needs to be thought of further, and he is not very sure about a certain interpretation. So he would at times just leave a certain verse open-ended by citing a couple of views, but not being able to give preference to either of them. But for the most part, I can say maybe 99%, he reflected on the Quranic text. He was a very competent scholar of Quranic Arabic, and he was also very well versed in the classical Arabic literature. He was taught, of course, by scholars themselves from the Madrasatul Islah, where he studied, and he had a very profound knowledge of classical Quranic language, and of course, which was a result of his he being conversant with the classical Arabic literature. So he showed in his tafsir that the Quran has a single meaning. And this is a huge contribution, as I think you would know, that people who study tafsir, they know that typically when you pick up a tafsir book, there are several interpretations of a single verse. And at times they are diverse, they are at times at variance to one another, they are opposite to one another. And it's difficult to see that how can different and diverse and even opposite interpretations of a single verse can coexist. So mostly our tafasir are exegetes, which have authored these tafasir or their exegesis. They have cited the opinions of past authorities. At times they do give preference to one of the opinions, but in most cases you'll find that a tafsir book is composed of several interpretations or several understandings given by different scholars, and it is left to the mind of the reader to gauge what best is his opinion. And at times the reader, of course, is not very well equipped, and he is left in a state of confusion as to what exactly is the meaning of a Quranic verse. So Ta'wil al-Wahid, which means a single interpretation of the Quranic text, is something that he actually demonstrated, a principle which was, as I said, formulated by Ustaz Hamiduddin Farahi, that the Quran has Ta'wil al-Wahid, which means a single interpretation. It is a text which cannot have diverse or different interpretations. And when people do differ, it's not because that the speaker had or the person who authored the Quran had different interpretations in mind. It is only because it is either a lack of knowledge from the part of the people who interpret it, or lack of deliberation on the text. which results in these different opinions. Otherwise, as far as the Almighty is concerned, He gave us the Quran with a single meaning. And He has demonstrated this on numerous occasions. I can cite many examples, but maybe I can suffice myself with maybe a couple of them. So if you pick up Surah Anam, you'll find that there is a verse which says that Ma farratna fil kitabi min shay, which translates into that I have not left out anything from this book, which of course, if is interpreted out of context, if it is interpreted the way I have read it out to you, would mean that there is everything in the Quran. Because you see, the words are, nothing have I left out. The Almighty is speaking, actually, the words are, nothing have we left out anything from the Quran. And this would, of course, imply that the Quran has all sorts of knowledge, all sorts of disciplines, all kinds of things which are found in it. And as a result, we see that the people have even made attempts to find out the roots of all sorts of things and all sorts of subjects and disciplines from within the Quran. So they will say it's a book of biology, it's a book of astronomy, it's a book of we have tips regarding gardening related in the Quran. And because of the fact that this verse has been interpreted in the light that nothing has been left out in it by the Almighty, and it is supposed to mean that all the disciplines of knowledge, everything that a person can think of, is found in this book. Now, if we study the context of this verse, we find out that the arguments in favor of monotheism are being discussed prior to this verse. And if interpreted in the context, it would mean that the Almighty has not left out anything vis-a-vis arguments and reasoning in favor of the dogma of Tawheed, or of the belief of monotheism. So what is being talked about is monotheism. And when the Quranic verse comes, when it is mentioned that we have not left out anything, it is actually referring to the fact that the Almighty says that we have not left out anything vis-a-vis the arguments, the reasoning that people would need in order to convince themselves of the belief of monotheism. So monotheism is being talked about. It's not that the Quran is saying that everything which is contained in the Quran, every discipline is contained in the Quran. And this, as I said, is one of the just one of the examples that I've given. Otherwise, you'll see that throughout the tafsir, Ustaz Amin and Islahi has shown that if you have a good grounding of Arabic literature, if you have a flair for the language, if you care for the context of the language, if you give due deliberation to how a Quranic surah proceeds from the beginning to the end, you are bound to get to the meaning which the Almighty has set out for the verse. Of course, there could be still differences, but then, as I said, these differences are on the part of the interpreter, not on the part of the fact that the Almighty Himself wanted the Quran to have more than one meaning. Another example that I would like to present before you is the example which is famously presented in Surah Waqia, which actually is a verse which supposedly tells us that doing wuzu is a requirement to read the Quran. So unless you are ceremonially, you have cleaned yourself, which you have in a state of ceremonial ablution, you cannot touch the Quran or read the Quran. And typically, as I said, the verse which is cited from Surah Al-Waqia, it says, La yamassuhu illa al-mutahharun. And it translates into that none but the pure touch it. So once again, you're left with this interpretation that if you read this through, you'll find out that the verse is saying that none except the pure, none except people who are in a state of ritual purity can touch the Quran. And this, of course, is the result that has been taken. This is the consequence of this interpretation. And as a result, our jurists have this conclusion drawn that only pure people, which means that only people who have done wuzu or they have done ablution can touch the Quran. Now, if you pick up this verse in the Quran and see how things are developing right before it and what exactly the context of this verse is, you'll find that it's an entirely different scenario which is being presented in context of this verse. So it goes something like this, that the disbelievers used to allege that the Quran has been revealed by evil spirits and they bringing down to the Prophet, and as a result, he presents the Quran from these evil spirits, which include the jinn, etc. So in response to this, the Almighty is saying that no, this is not true. Only the pure touch it and bring it down, which of course means that the contrary to the evil spirits, it is the angels who bring down the Quran. So the mutahharun word, which means the pure, does not relate to human beings. In context, it relates to the angels. And it's actually a rebuttal to the disbelievers who would say, as I said, that the Quran is brought down by evil spirits or only people who are, spirits who are not pure. They are the ones who inspire the Quran, or the Quran has been revealed by such creatures on the Prophet. And in rebuttal to this, as a refutation to this, the Almighty has said, no, this is not true. Only the pure angels bring it down. So you see, if you study the context, you'll immediately find that it has nothing to do with wuzu or the fact that you have to be ritually pure to touch the Quran. What this verse is actually telling us is that angels who are pure souls, they are the ones who bring down the Quran. So the verse in context has nothing to do with ceremonial ablution or wuzu, as I said. So you'll see that if you are able to study this exegesis, you will find out that these are just two examples that are presented out of the numerous examples that exist. And in each of these examples, Ustaz Amin Islahi has shown significant mastery of the Arabic language, and has shown that if you directly deliberate on the Quran, if you directly think on the text of the Quran, and give due deference to the context and what is being discussed, you are bound to get to the right meaning. The second major contribution of Ustaz Amin Islahi is that he has interpreted this the Quran on the basis of the mutawatir meaning, reading of the Quran, the only mutawatir reading of the Quran, which is at times also called the reading of Hafs, but its correct name is the Qira'atul Amma. So right before him, it was of course Ustaz Hamiduddin Farahi who laid stress on the fact that as far as the interpretation of the Quran is concerned, we just simply cannot interpret the Quran on variant readings, because these variant readings do not qualify to be the Quran per se. They have their own origin, and that can be explained, and I have tried and endeavored to explain that elsewhere in my own lectures as well, and people can look them up. But as I said here, the contribution of Ustaz Amin Islahi has to be understood, that he has shown that as far as the variant readings of the Quran are concerned, which we think have originated from various readers, and we know that the 7 famous readers which were selected by Abu Bakr ibn Mujahid in the 4th century, they became famous, and then 3 more were added, and we had 10 famous readers of the Quran, each transmitting a reading of the Quran which was different from the other. But as far as the mutawatir reading, what does tawatur actually mean? Tawatur means the reading, or the mutawatir reading is that reading which was transmitted from the Prophet through the Sahaba in such a large number that each step of their generation that came after them, any collusion on falsehood could not have been imagined. So such a vast number of people transmitted the Quranic reading that has reached us, that the only reading that we can say is the real Quran is that mutawatir reading. As far as other variant readings are concerned, which we will find copiously quoted in our tafsir books, if you pick up any Arabic tafsir, you'll find that typically when an exegete interprets a Quranic verse, he would also cite variant readings and will tell us that, look, the Quran was also read like this, and this is how it was interpreted, or can be interpreted if some other meaning is accepted. We have exegetes of the Quran who have actually done this exegesis on other readings. So we have exegetes who have done the exegesis of the Quran on, for example, Nafi's reading. Nafi was the reciter of North Africa, and his 2 students, Qalun and Warsh, they were the ones who transmitted his reading. But as far as Ustaz Amin Islahi is concerned, and of course his illustrious predecessor and his mentor, Ustaz Hamiduddin Farahi, they insist that the only reading that has reached us and which can be qualified as the reading of the Prophet is the Qira'atul Amma, or the mutawatir reading, and hence there is absolutely no possibility that the Quran can or should be interpreted by through variant readings. Just to give you one example, So Ustaz Amin Hassan Islahi has actually shown that if you interpret some of these Quranic readings, at times the context itself does not accept these variant readings, and it just spills them away. It just it rejects them from the very inside. And the famous example of Arjulakum ilal Ka'bayn, which of course is the wuzu verse in Surah Ma'idah, in which if the mutawatir reading is understood correctly, then it would mean that you have to wash your feet as far as doing wuzu is concerned. But if you read one of the non-mutawatir readings, for example, the reading of Nafi, I just referred to him, you'll find out that it says that even the feet need not be washed during wuzu, and it's enough to masa or wipe them. It's difficult for me to perhaps explain the intricacies of this, if this research that he has presented. Perhaps readers can look it up in his tafsir. But to give you a gist of it, that such is the nature of mention of these limbs that have to be washed or done masa upon in the Quran, that if you insert the non-mutawatir, or if you interpret the Quran on the non-mutawatir reading, you'll see that the Quranic text itself rejects it in its own right, because there are certain words which then become redundant. So I'm just giving a hint. Otherwise, it's best to look up this tafsir under the wuzu verse, and you'll find how Ustaz Amin Hassan Islahi has shown that these variant readings, when they are incorporated or even thought of being interpreted, then the text does not accept them. So this is a big contribution. People who might not have the background may feel that this is something not very important, but I can tell you that if you are aware of the tafsir literature today, which has its sources in Arabic language, so starting off with the earliest of tafsirs like the tafsir of Tabari, we have then people like Zamakhshari, we have people like Imam Fakhruddin Razi, we have people like Ibn Kasir, we have Abu Hayyan, we have a host of Mufassirun, we have a host of exegetes in Arabic language that whenever they interpret the Quran, they just don't always do it according to the mutawatir reading. They do it on other variant readings as well, and they think that some of the other readings are equally applicable as the Quran, and they actually qualify to become the Quran. So it is for the first time in the history of tafsir literature that Ustaz Amin Farahi vehemently negated that, and it was left to his disciple, Ustaz Amin Hassan Islahi, to demonstrate this. And he actually, when he wrote the foreword of this book, of this exegesis, he mentioned this fact that he has done this tafsir on the basis of the mutawatir reading, which is a singular contribution, and it needs to be lauded as well. The third contribution that I'd like to bring before all of you is one of his original contributions. The first two contributions, you can say, have a very heavy leaning on the thought of his mentor, Ustaz Amin Farahi. But as far as this third contribution, which I'm just going to mention before you, is the contribution in which he has shown that the Quran has structural coherence. So this structural coherence, as far as the Quran is concerned, it is of the sort that the Quran is divided into 7 distinct chapters. So because the Quran has 7 distinct chapters, each chapter has a theme, and each chapter has this distinction in which every chapter of the Quran starts off with one or more than one Meccan surah, and ends on one or more than one Medinan surah. And each of these surahs within a chapter, they are in chronological sequence. So in each chapter, amongst these 7 chapters, the surahs are in a historical sequence. So you'll have the Meccan surahs first and the Medinan ones after that. And in the Meccan surahs also, the sequence is historical. So the first Meccan surah would have been revealed before the second Meccan surah, and so on and so forth. So this division, which he has actually spelled out, is something which he has said that it is a mansus interpretation, which is something which the Quran itself has pointed out. And in Surah Hijr, the words are, وَلَقَدْ آتَيْنَاكَ سَبْعًا مِنَ الْمَثَانِي, which means that, O Prophet, we have given you 7 composed of pairs, 7 composed of pairs, which, according to Ustaz Amin Hassan Islahi, actually refers to 7 chapters of the Quran, such that each chapter of the Quran is composed of surahs which occur in pairs. So this is a phenomenal discovery which he has made, and which changes the entire complexion of the Quran. So the structure of the Quran, which hitherto was being just signifying the fact that it has 114 surahs, and generally people thought that the longer surahs come first and then the shorter ones follow. And it's like this is how the Quran has been arranged. But Ustaz Muhyiddin Farai, in the light of this Quranic verse, has made this astounding contribution and has told us that, well, it's not just like a ordinary book which is just composed of 114 chapters or 114 surahs, as people call them. So when I talk about chapters, I'm not talking about the surahs, because people generally translate surahs in the English language as chapters. I'm talking about the 7 groups of the Quran, or 7 sections of the Quran, which Ustaz Amin Islahi in Urdu has called them groups. So because the word groups is also used in both languages, so generally people have stuck to the word group, but I think a more appropriate translation would be chapters. So 7 chapters of the Quran, and each chapter has surahs which occur in pair. They are complementary to one another. So just let me give you an outline of these 7 chapters. For example, the first chapter begins with Surah Fatiha, and then it ends on Surah Maida, which is the 5th surah. The first 5 surahs, they make up the first chapter of the Quran. Then the second chapter starts with the 6th surah, which is Surah Anam, and goes on to the 9th surah, which is Surah Tawbah. So from 6 to 9, we have the second chapter of the Quran. The third chapter begins with Surah Yunus, which is the 10th surah of the Quran, and goes on to the 24th surah of the Quran, which is Surah Nur. And then we have the 4th chapter of the Quran, which starts with Surah Furqan, and it ends on Surah Ahzab, which is the 33rd surah of the Quran. And then we have the 5th chapter of the Quran, which starts off with the 34th surah of the Quran, and it ends on the 49th surah of the Quran, which is Surah Ahzab. And then we have the 6th chapter of the Quran, which begins with the 50th surah of the Quran, which is Surah Qaf, and it ends on the 66th surah, which is Surah Tahrim. And then we have the last chapter of the Quran, which begins with the 67th surah of the Quran, which is Surah Mulk, and ends on Surah Nas, which is the last surah of the Quran, the 114th surah. So in this way, these are 7 discrete chapters of the Quran. In each of these chapters, the surahs occur in prayer. Yes, there are exceptions. For example, if you take the first chapter, Surah Fatiha is an exception. It does not have a pair. It's like an introduction to the whole of the Quran. But the pairs within the first chapter are Surah Baqarah forms a pair with Surah Al Imran. So the second and the third surahs are like pairs. And the third and the fourth and the fifth surah, which are surahs Nisa and Surah Maida, they form pairs as well. And the nature of this pairing also is very subtle. So at times, reasonings which is offered in favor of a particular premise might be historical in the first surah, but it might be based on arguments drawn on human nature or on the afaq, as the Quran tells us, that the world around human beings. So the arguments might be drawn from history in one surah, and the same premise would be established by arguments drawn from some other part of our domain. So these, to give you an example, for Surah Baqarah and Surah Al Imran, so they form a pair. So as far as the paired phenomena is concerned between these two surahs, you can clearly see that in Surah Baqarah, the Jews are addressed of the times of the Prophet, and a charge sheet of their crimes has been presented. Whereas in Surah Al Imran, the stress is presenting the same charge sheet, of course, which is peculiar to the Christians or the Nazarenes of the times of the Prophet. And so there is this complementary relationship between Surah Al Imran and Surah Baqarah. And I think to a common reader, this close relationship between a paired surah can clearly be seen in the last two surahs, like Surah Falaq and Surah Nas, the way they are presented and the way they occur at the end of the Quran, and the way they present the meanings of the Quran. It is so close, they are so close to one another that one is bound to notice the nature of similarity between these two surahs. So A little deliberation will show that throughout the Quran, this paired phenomena of surahs is there. And to once again recap, as I said, these 7 chapters they are discrete units. They start off with Meccan surahs, they end on Medinan surahs. Always the surah which comes first in a chapter would have been revealed the first as well. And in all these 7 chapters, the preaching mission or some part of the preaching mission of the Prophet Muhammad would be discussed. So at times, a major part of the Medinan sector of his ministry would be discussed. At times, a major part of the Meccan ministry would be discussed. At times, both of them would be discussed. So we have the Meccan and the Medinan periods being discussed in various aspects in these chapters. And as I said, each chapter has a theme as well. And then also, not only the chapters have theme, the surahs themselves also, they have themes. They have particular themes, which of course means that the contents of that surah, they are directed towards that theme. And then another important area is that the addressees are also very, very specific in all these chapters and have to be determined. For example, there are surahs which are directed to the Prophet. There are surahs which are directed to the Jews, to the Christians, and there are surahs which have partly verses directed towards the Muslims, similarly towards the hypocrites. So within these surahs, you'll find God speaking to various groups at the same time. And it's like a back and forth and a right and left sort of conversation. It's like a sermon being delivered by the Almighty. It's something that he's talking to people from one section to another. And one of the reasons which Ustaz Amin and Islahi has pointed out, that if we don't understand this nature of the Quran, that how it speaks towards various groups of people standing in front of them, of the Prophet, by going across them from right to left, that at times we feel these disjointedness in the discourse of the Quran. And the nature of this disjointedness can be easily understood, that there is absolutely no case of any hiccups or disjointedness or haphazardness, because if we give due deference and due consideration to the fact that the Quran is speaking to more than one audience, and that again is being shifted from right to left, from back and forth, from one addressee to another addressee. So the shift that we generally see, and we find as if there is some incoherence, will easily be accounted for if we are able to understand that how a discourse within a surah progresses, how this progression is not always linear. It's not that you're always going in one direction. At times, the discourse comes back to a particular area. It goes back to a point that was discussed. It picks it up once again and then elaborates on that. So it's like a germ idea which was floated once, and then the verses take up that germ idea. And once that idea is finished, the next verses then come back to the original theme that was being carried on. So this is one way in which this discourse within a surah goes forth. And it's not always a linear connection, which has generally been understood by other people who have also presented their own theories on coherence or nazm. Like, for example, Imam Razi, who has this concept that nazm is like a linear progression in which you just look at the previous verse and then go on. As far as Ustaz Amin Farahi and Amin Islahi are concerned, they have shown that the ingredients of nazm, the way discourse progresses, it is like a multi-dimensional discourse. At times, something is floated and there's a small digression which takes place. That digression actually is like picking up a point from the previous verse. Once that digression is finished, the next verses pick up the same discourse from the previous point that had been left. We have parenthetical sentences in which things are inserted. Once that parenthetical sentence finishes, once again, the discourse goes back to its original form. We have a discourse in which at times important entities, a discourse would start off by that important entity and would end on the same important entity. For example, there are surahs in the Quran which at times discuss the qualities of the believers, and they would start off with the first quality, and the prayer would be typically mentioned. And you'll find the same discourse ending on the prayer as well. So it's like a circular thing, or in technical terms, it's called Aud al-Bad, which means returning to the origin. And then we have similes, we have parables, we have statements in which at times answers are given in a way that the question cited is very brief. And then we have questions being raised in a way that they are indirect and being answered by the discourse itself. So it's like such a living and such a powerful discourse that it eludes the mind at times if you don't have that connection and have that flair for the language itself. So the way the Quranic surahs progress has a very significant import as far as interpretation is concerned. So this is one of the most original contributions which Ustaz Amin Islahi has made. And as I said, once he had discovered these 7 chapters, which was, of course, done individually, he found that within the Quran, this particular Quranic verse, which I just cited of Surah Hijr, it actually corroborates this finding, because, as I said, this verse says that, the Prophet, we have given you 7 composed of pairs. So the only thing needed was to furnish the noun qualified by this adjective. So these are basically 7 chapters composed of pairs, which means 7 chapters composed of surah pairs. This is what he has shown in his tafsir. And although it's not my topic at the moment, but his own student and disciple, Ustaz Javed Ahmad Ghamidi, has further given precision to this concept. And inshallah, sometime later, we might take it up and discuss it as well. But as I said, this significant contribution has given the Quran a structural coherence in it. It has given it it has presented the book as a book in which these 7 discrete sections can be understood, they can be communicated, and it can be shown that how within the Quran, these 7 chapters, they actually evolve, they sort of go in a fashion, in a sequence in which the chapter coming from the next chapter, which is placed before the previous chapter, it actually very logically emanates from that first chapter, and so on and so forth. So this is it's such a unique picture of the Quran, which comes to our notice if we see how Ustaz Amin Islahi has done this tafsir, that people who have experienced or studied his tafsir will understand that how great a difference it makes in understanding the Quran, in presenting the Quran to our younger generation, in introducing the Quran to people who are not aware of the Quran, and how beautifully structured this book of God is. The fourth contribution of Ustaz Amin Islahi that I'd like to bring forth is the fact that he has shown that how important it is to rely on the authority of the Quran. So the Quran is the Mizan and the Furqan, which means that nothing at all, even the statement ascribed to the Prophet, if it is not in conformity with the Quran says, even if it is sort of attributed to him and the isnad is absolutely correct, even then it cannot be accepted if it goes against the Quran. Well, you can say that this is something of a reality which every mufassir of the Quran has stated, that no hadith which is repugnant to the Quran or against the Quran will be accepted. But as you would have seen, or maybe people who like you have studied the tafsir literature will show, that in spite of making this claim, there are so many instances in which hadith literature or certain ahadith which clearly go against the Quran, they are justified in a very vague way, in a very unconvincing way. And it has been left to Ustaz as an Islahi, who has shown that how so many ahadiths in the which are cited in tafsir literature, they are absolutely against what the Quran has told us. Again, there are so many examples, and I have done a lot of work on these examples as well in some of my books as well. But to give you maybe one of them, he has shown how that very famously we know that Surah Falaq was actually revealed, or the Mu'awwidhatayn as they are called, the last 2 surahs of the Quran were revealed when there was a magic spell which had been woven across on the Prophet, and he had become influenced by that magical spell. And he had shown that this, people have quoted hadith which says that when he was under this magical spell, he would not know whether he had offered the prayer or not, whether he had done a particular routine or not. He was suffering from forgetfulness. And as a result, this is something which goes not only against the literature itself. You'll find out that the hadith itself, the way it has presented, has a lot of flaws vis-a-vis its isnad and its content. It is also against the Quran, because this would actually affect the infallibility of the Prophet as far as giving the Sharia or the religion of God is concerned. So Hadith literature tells us that it was not for 1 or 2 or 3 days, it was for a period of 6 months that the Prophet was suffering from this spell of magic, and in which he was not aware of what was going on most of the time. So in this 6 months, it could well have been that the Quranic verses would have been revealed to him, and he might have forgotten to communicate it to the rest of the Muslim Ummah. This is quite probable. So Ustaz Amin Islahi has shown that this is something which is, as far as the literature itself is concerned, the hadiths themselves are concerned, if you go into them, you'll find out that they have a weak chain of narration. And then again, if you look at the Quran, it says that the religion has been protected from any incursion as far as its presentation is concerned. So these narratives cannot be accepted, and therefore, even if you find them to be so soundly ascribed, but if they go against the Quran, then they have to be rejected. So I can give several other examples, but just to let us know that the authority of the Quran on all sorts of extraneous literature, which include hadith, the asar, historical narratives, has been grappled by him. He has shown that wherever a narrative has challenged the authority of the Quran, then the authority of the Quran is something which shall always prevail. And as a result, this phenomena is something which people will only realize once they see how some of the other tafsir literature, in which there are narratives quoted in abundance and such copiously, and at times these narratives, they infringe on the authority of the Quran. When you study some of these narratives, you'll find that the narrative is saying one thing, and as far as the Quranic verse is concerned, it is saying something entirely different. But then there is a reconciliation which is made, and effectively what happens is that the hadith or literature which is outside the Quran is given more importance, and it is said that the Quran has to be interpreted in the light of these narratives. On the contrary, the thought which is presented by Ustaz Amin Islahi is quite the reverse, that it is hadith which has to be interpreted in the light of the Quran, not the reverse, because the Quran has a definite context, the Quran has a different corpus. As far as hadith literature is concerned, it has inherent flaws and weaknesses, in spite of the fact it has a lot of wisdom, it has a lot to give, it has a lot to present as far as the knowledge of the Prophet is concerned. But because of its conjectural and speculative nature and the way it has been transmitted, it has to be judged and only then accepted. And precisely keeping in view this aspect, Ustaz Amin Islahi has actually written a book on the principles of interpretation of hadith, in which he has shown that how important it is to give due consideration to these principles in understanding a hadith. The fifth and final contribution of Ustaz Amin Islahi, and which is of course a crowning achievement that he has made, although it's not exactly something which is which can be originally ascribed to him. This is again something which has its roots in the thought of his mentor, Ustaz Amin Farai, is the fact that he has shown that there is this difference between the status of a Nabi and a Rasul, so a prophet and a messenger of God. And he has shown that the Quran, if it is not understood in the light of the fact that there are certain specific verses of the Quran which only address God's messengers, and they are verses which cannot be extended beyond the domain of the messengerhood of these messengers. And if they are not interpreted in the light of this law, then we will end up extending a lot of verses of the Quran which relate to a certain aspect of this law into the era which we call the post-prophetic era. So he has shown in his exegesis that as far as the Quran is concerned, there is a specific law which is mentioned in the Quran, and that law is that the messengers of God are bound to prevail whenever they come in this world. And amongst those, the cadre of the messengers is a different cadre from the prophets. So the prophets all messengers are prophets, but not all prophets are messengers. So a particular prophet is selected and given the status of a messenger, which can be translated as a Rasul. So a prophet could be called a Nabi, and a messenger is a Rasul. So prophets who become messengers, for them, the Almighty has shown that the accountability of their nations take place in this very world, so that this accountability can become a proof for the rest of the world that their accountability is going to take place one day. It might not take place in this world, but yes, it's going to take place in the hereafter. So there are several verses of the Quran which have to be understood in the light of this law which states that the messengers of God are bound to prevail. And the most important implication of this law is that if it is not understood in its context, then certain verses which are specific to the messengers of God, we will end up actually acting upon those verses, and in particular verses which relate to jihad, verses which relate to the killing of the idolaters, verses which might relate to disbelief, apostasy. All these verses are verses which relate to the era of God's messengers, and they cannot be extended in the post-prophetic era, because these verses are basically related to this law of messengerhood. And this law of messengerhood, the reason that it has been mentioned in the Quran, as I said, is because God wants us to pay heed to the notion of accountability. Each one is going to be held accountable today. Today we are living in the post-prophetic era in which prophets of God, his messengers, don't come. So, and we are bound to lose sight of this accountability. So when we read the Quran, again and again, we find the accounts of the previous nations being discussed. And Ustaz Amin Islahi has shown actually that these accounts tell us that their nations were always vanquished if they, or destroyed if they denied their particular messenger. And in the times of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, of course, the way that destruction took place for previous messengers was through natural disasters. But in the time of the Prophet Muhammad, the Almighty said that if these people intentionally deny the truth, then the punishment which previously descended in the forms of cyclones and tempests and earthquakes would now take place through the swords of the disbelievers. So there were certain prerogatives which were given to these believers so that they could implement God's justice on this earth. But then this, as I said, was the prerogative of only the Prophet and his messengers and his companions. So if we start following them in this particular area, like for example, today people like Osama bin Laden, Mullah Umar, or Abu Bakr Baghdadi, the way they think that that disbelief and polytheism has to be challenged and put to destruction, we will end up not understanding the Quran the way its author has presented us. Its author wants us to understand that as far as the specific nature of this law is concerned, it is just for the messengers of God. They act as God's instrument of justice on this earth, and they set up this court of justice so that for the rest of mankind, it becomes a reminder, a continuous reminder that this court of justice for them will also be set up in the next world. So these were the 5 important contributions that I wanted to present before you as far as his Quranic thought was concerned. So just to recap that, first of all, he showed that the Quran has a single interpretation. Al-Quran la yahtamilu illa ta'wilin wahid. So just a single interpretation. If you are a good connoisseur of the language of the Quran, you are bound to understand that this is not that the Quran is going to offer you different interpretations. It's a single interpretation. The second important contribution that he made was regarding the fact that he just interpreted the Quran on the mutawatir reading, the Qira'atul Amma, contrary to a host of other exegetes. The third contribution that he made was regarding the structural coherence of the Quran, which I just described earlier on, that it is composed of 7 discrete chapters, and each chapter has a very, very specific setup that we have to understand. The fourth important contribution that I described before you was regarding the authority of the Quran and how it is to prevail on all external literature, all extraneous literature, and it cannot be understood in the light of the Hadith. It's actually the reverse, that the Hadith has to be interpreted in the light of the Quran. Finally, I also presented the fact that one of his crowning achievements, which was actually an extension of what his mentor had already discovered, was this law of Nabuwa and Risala, which means messengers of God have a very special status and they prevail on their nation. They conduct jihad in a way that they vanquish and conquer the disbelievers. And this jihad is basically a punishment for deliberate denial of the truth. And this was specific to them. This cannot be undertaken in later times. And this singular understanding is something which, if properly gauged, will make us understand not only the Quran, but also the previous scriptures like the Torah and Injil, because this law is something which was always there. Not only does the Quran mention it, the previous scriptures also mention it. So just to also give you another angle of Ustaz Amin Islahi's personality, I was able to study with him for 4 years or 3.5 years of his life. Well, it's like 1988 to 1994, 1993, the last 3 or 4 years or 5 years, when just before falling sick, he was able to continue with his teaching. So a lot of us, including many of my colleagues, we would go to him every week, and we would take lectures from him on the Quran and Hadith. And it was a experience that it is one of its kind and simply cannot be at times even described. But one thing that I would like to present before you, which he often used to say, and I think he was one of the biggest and the perfect examples and exemplars of what he used to say, and that is, he said that abide by the truth, even if your shadow deserts you. So it's a sentence which was so profound, that abide by the truth, if your shadow deserts you, would mean that you have to cling to the truth even if you're left alone, so alone that even your shadow is not with you, signifying the fact that if you think that something is right, something is according to your own conscience, something is according to your own understanding, it doesn't matter whether other people are with you or they are against you. You have to cling to that single thread of truth that comes your way. And I can vouch for the fact that in my short encounters with him, I have seen him clinging to the truth. I have seen him how he would change his opinions when students would come up to him and even present some of the alternative explanations. There are examples, and I can also tell you that he was a person who would fall down before the truth, as if everything has come to the ground before him. So I would now end my talk here, and I have given a very brief overview of his Quranic contribution and some of the facets of his personality. But we have a website running up on his personality, which is amin-ahsan-islahi.org, which actually presents his lectures in audio format. There are a couple of videos as well. We have his books on this website, and we have some of the other material. We also are setting up a museum, on an online museum. We plan to do that, in which we'll display some of his relics as well. But then, as I said, as far as humanity is concerned, as far as people are concerned, people come and people go. But if you ask me, I would say that just as Plato and Socrates were two people, they were so joined together. Plato was like a person who explained the thoughts of his predecessor and his illustrious Socrates. It seems to me that it's in exactly the same fashion. Ustaz Amin Islahi was the Plato of his Socrates, who was Ustaz Amin Farahi. He was someone who actually completed, and not only completed, as I said, but added some new feathers. He added some new contributions, some original contributions to the thought of his mentor. And we pray that today, when we are talking about him, it's almost a quarter of a century that he has left us, that God forgives his blemishes, raises his ranks, and at the same time, we are able to benefit from his Quranic thought. So thank you very much for listening to me. I am now available for any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Salim, for the insightful history of the contributions of Ustaz Amin Ahsan Islahi. I was wondering, the concept of Ta'wil Wahid, was that something initiated by Maulana Hamiduddin Farahi, or was this a concept that existed well before his time as well?
It was a concept which, to my understanding and to my knowledge, is something which was put forward by Ustaz Hamiduddin Farahi. I haven't seen anyone before him, because you see, before him, generally, the interpretations which were made were not, they were not considered to be, they were not given this mandate, or they didn't think that they had this mandate to have a single interpretation of the Quran. To them, it was like citing different interpretations of different scholars under the same verse. For example, they would say that, look, one Sahabi interpreted this verse in this meaning, and one Tabi did this in another meaning. So the general custom was to cite different interpretations. And at times, the Mufassir would give preference to one of these interpretations, and on many occasions, he would just leave it open-ended, that this is how people have variously interpreted it, so that people who read it and come up with their own preference. And many a time they would not even come up with a preference. In fact, it was considered to be the beauty of the Quran that it has multi-layer. It's like a multi-layered book which has multifarious meanings. So Ustaz Amin Islahi has taken exception to this, and he says that, well, if there are multi-meanings to a text, that this is not a complement to that text. It's like a defect in that text, because when I'm speaking, I do want to convey one single meaning. So how can we say that God had several meanings before him when he was delivering a very definite discourse to humankind?
Thank you, Dr. Salim. I was also wondering, when and how did the subcontinent gain a different understanding of the Quranic meanings and Islamic practices? For example, you mentioned wudu before touching the Quran, or some people, when they say to wear a scarf during the adhan, since it's not an understanding that takes place in Saudi Arabia.
Well, as I said, these are things which have their cultural roots. They have their roots into traditional understanding of religion. And because of the fact that it's not always, I mean, generally what has happened in our subcontinent is that once an opinion has been formed by a past authority, it has been transmitted without critically evaluating it. It's like blindly following that opinion. At times it is influenced by culture. At times it is influenced by some traditional thought given by a scholar, and it just becomes famous, and it goes on and on. So critical evaluation of opinions is something which was never encouraged in our religious society, when people had generally the acquiescent attitude in which they would accept whatever would be told, and they would be actually discouraged from critically evaluating opinions or even asking questions. So this is something which actually I would say started off with the Shibli Nomani, even before him, maybe from Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan, one of the luminaries. And yes, there are differences of opinion that we can have with him, but I think he was one of the founding fathers of this reflection on the Quran in a way that we need to understand it from its direct text. But then this took a pronounced turn when we had the arrival of Ustaz Hamid Farahi on our planet, in the subcontinent. So he was born in India in 1863, and he passed away in 1930. So he was a phenomenal scholar of the Quran, and he was like one of the most outstanding and distinguished people who had this feeling that we have to understand the Quran directly from the text of the Quran. All that we need is a very, very profound understanding of the idiom of the Quran, the language of the Quran, the way God speaks. So therefore, Ustaz Hamid Farahi was very well grounded in the Arabic of the Quran and in the classical Arabic literature. He had also a very sound grounding of the previous scriptures. So he was an expert, or a very, very adept interpreter of the Old and the New Testament. And he even started to write an explanation and an exegesis. He could not complete it, but then we can see glimpses of his interpretation within the Quranic text as well when he was interpreting it. So these were some of the requirements that are essential and were essential to him. And I think that he is the person with whom this originality of giving due importance to the text of the Quran is concerned, because he argued that the Almighty never revealed an explanation of the Quranic text. That is why we have to understand the text directly from the text itself, and not become dependent on extraneous sources. Yes, they can be helpful sources, but they cannot be the definitive sources or the primary sources. They are secondary sources. So he gave this importance. He adjudicated that as far as the Quran is concerned, it tells us that it is in eloquent Arabic. The words are Quranic. The Quran has been revealed in eloquent Arabic. Arabiya Mubin are the words. So if it is revealed in such eloquent Arabic, then we have to be scholars of that Arabic. And if we can become those scholars, then we have to understand the Quran directly from its text. So this textual study and this text-centered approach is something which was his hallmark, and which we can say is the hallmark of the Farahi scholars and the Farahi school, because Ustaz Hamid Farahi can also be termed as a person who actually founded this school, and his disciple and and pupil, Ustaz Amin Ahsan Islahi, about whom I just spoke about, actually furthered his views. And then, of course, our own teacher, Ustaz Javed Ahmad Ghamidi, he is the third in line to this school of thought. And to all these three scholars, it is the text of the Quran which holds such sanctity and it holds such importance that you have to be a good scholar of the text of the Quran and then understand the text directly from the text and, of course, context.
Thank you for that, Dr. Salim. Yasin Fahad, you're up next. Please go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Shazad.
Walaikum assalam.
I have a question about New Testament. My son asked me that the way I think it's worded is that it says Jesus said this, Jesus said that. So he was saying that it appears to him that it's more like hadith, like, where the disciples are narrating everything. So if it was a revelation from the God, and if it came through Jibreel alayhi salam to Isa alayhi salam, why is it worded like this, that they start with Jesus said this, Jesus said that?
Well, I think I've explained this elsewhere, that as far as the the New Testament is concerned, which is the Injil, it was never recorded in its original language, which is the Syriac language. Today we have its translations, and your son is absolutely right when he says that these Gospels, basically these are biographies which are narrated by his disciples or people who saw him. So what people have done is that they have published a red letter Bible, which means that the words spoken by Jesus, they are thought to be divine words which were inspired by God himself, so to speak. So that part is published separately in red letters so that the divine part of the New Testament could be distinguished. But again, as I said, this divine part that we have is allegedly the divine part, because these are the words of what Jesus alleged to have spoken. Because, as I said, the original language was Syriac, and the Bible or the Injil was never written in this language. It was written for the first time in Greek language, and then translated into other languages like Latin, etc., and then later on into English language. So we don't have the original text of the New Testament, but what we can gauge from the New Testament is that the words spoken by Jesus, as you just said, that Jesus said this and said that. So that part that he spoke, as I said, people have just published it separately in red letters. If you could read through that part, you can safely say that this is allegedly the divine part. Again, that divine part means a translation of some translation originally, which has not survived, but perhaps close to that translation. The words that we now have that are now spoken by Jesus are the ones close to which the original ones might have been revealed.
So that means, sir, that whatever Jesus said, or the way it's written, it was actually revealed to him from the God, right? With angel Jibreel, right? Yeah. So in that case, like, I know that, we take Quran as the criterion over all the other books, but then I have heard you and Ghamidi Sahab also saying that, you should read the Bible and you can see it's word of God. Then how would you know that, if whatever is written in those red letters or whatever, does it really makes you feel like that is word of God? Like,
yes, you don't need to read it to make this adjudication. As I said, you'll find it so close to what you read in the Quran. These words would be so close to your heart, because whatever Jesus is reportedly have said and has been cited in the Bible is like you'll find a lot of teachings of the Quran being repeated there, or being found there in just a different way, in a very passionate way, in the form of similes, in the form of parables, in the form of very moving sentences. So it's just a question of reading it, and you'll find it that this is so close to the Quran. And one more thing that needs to be understood is that the Quran has made this statement several times. It has said that the religion that was revealed to mankind, to all prophets, was always the same. So bearing this in mind, that the message of all the scriptures is the same, it is bound to be true that basically the message also, when you read the previous scriptures, should be no different, except where interpolations have been made, and they can be detected. I can tell you that there are two distinct areas in which changes and interpolations have been made in the Torah or in the Injil. So one of them is it relates to prophecies of the arrival of the last prophet. So they have been tampered with, and Prophet Muhammad's name has been either distorted or deleted from those passages. And the second important area is the relationship of Abraham with the Arabian Peninsula, because in the Torah it is said that the son who Abraham attempted to slaughter was Isaac and not Ishmael. So that the relationship between Abraham is severed from the Arabian Peninsula, and it is established between the in the territory of Jerusalem, and the last prophet is not even mentioned as a result. So basically, it is this area in which distortions have taken place in the Bible and in the New Testament as well. But other than that, you'll find a very, very large chunk of these scriptures to be so common that if you have you read the Quran, you'll find them closely following the text of the Quran.
So, sir, if we take the example of Sermon of the Mount that Jesus said, and I would imagine, like, the the khutbah that Prophet gave, the last khutbah, but the khutbah that Prophet Muhammad ﷺ gave was of his own thing, right? But the Sermon of the Mount, from the Jesus, is that something that was revealed to Jesus that he was telling the people, that he was asked to say?
That is what we have to imagine, that whatever he was talking about, I mean, you do understand that there's the things that he said were, of course, at times they were said by his own self, but we can see clearly that there were things that he spoke on behalf of God. So it might be difficult today to say which were the things that he spoke himself, because we don't have a particular, a yardstick to do that. But in all probability, we can see clearly, because, as I said, if you read the New Testament in the light of the Quran, you'll just find such a strong reflection of the Quran if you just backward project the Quran within in the Sermon on the Mount, that you'll see that whatever he spoke actually was from God.
Okay. I have another question, but I will wait. If someone else has a question, please go ahead.
Oh, you can continue. We currently don't have any more raised hands.
Okay. I just had another question from my daughter yesterday, and we were discussing the Quran, and we came upon the verse where it said that we will unite the children with their parents in Jannah. And she asked me that if that's how it's going to work, then everybody will be pulled up. So everybody would end up in one level, because she said everybody is linked to Adam alayhi salam eventually. So she said someone's parents will be someone's children, and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. So how do I explain that to her? Because I told her I will ask my teacher and I will let you know.
Well, you see, the nature of these inhabitants of paradise is different, because you see, there will be the Sabiqun, which are the foremost, and there would be the Ashabul Yameen. So because of the fact that paradise would itself be divided into two great divisions, that the people who are exceptional, they would be on the top tier, and people who would be good, but they're called Ashabul Yameen, they would be in the second tier. So within this second tier, of course, the movement would take place that the children would be united with their own parents, but not always would this be the case, because at times the parents with whom they would be united, they might not be united with their own parents because of the difference in level, as I said, that might take place. So it's not that this pulling up will take place and take you right to the top, because these two distinctions are there. And the Ashabul Yameen and the foremost, which is the Sabiqun, they are going to be there. But even within these folds, separately these folds, as I said, this sharing of the same status is going to take place when the children they're going to go to their own parents and become united. But then it's not necessary that the same parents will also go to their own parents, because unless they were of the same category, they would be of course pulled up. But if they're not there, then they'll stay in their position, so to speak. This is how I understand. But if not so, then I would say that these two categories would always be the same. They will be always different, because the Jannah or the paradise of the Sabiqun is going to be a higher paradise than the one which is occupied by the Ashabul Yameen.
So if a parent is in Sabiqun and then the children are in Ashabul Yameen, so then they won't be united?
I should think so. That this is my first understanding, because these are two different like two compartments within heaven, within paradise. Because these are two things which make them eligible
And it
separately.
will, and sir, it will be either way, right? If children are higher, then the parents will be pulled up, and if the parents are higher, the children will be
So
pulled
we are
up.
told about. So basically, the verse which is in Surah Tur, it is about the children. It's spoken
Oh,
about the children.
okay. Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
We have a question in the chat, wondering about which book did you talk about when saying to study the hadith in the light of the Quran? One of the books for Maulana Amin Ahsan Islahi.
So it's a book which is called Mabadi Tadabbur Hadith, written. Basically, these are lectures which were transcribed in the form of a book, and it has also been translated into English by the name of Principles of Interpreting Hadith. Both these books are found at the website that I was referring to.
Thank you very much. Noshad Shafkat, please go ahead.
Yes, Dr. Sab, I'm in the process of learning Quranic Arabic. Now, of course, I can't be a master because that is not my main field. But how would you suggest going about it to understand the Quran in its correct perspective? And what steps do I need to take to be able to understand the true meaning of the Quran?
I think what you have started off is the right procedure, is the right way. Just learn Quranic Arabic instead of learning Arabic as a language, because that's a long thing and does not relate directly to your quest, because you want to understand the Quran. And there's a shorter route available to that, and that is just pick up a good website or a good book, or there are so many apps as well. There is a site called arabicacademy.com, etc. You'll find several of these which teach Quranic Arabic. And if you just stick to learning Quranic Arabic, it'll be a shorter route for you to understand the Quran. And as I said, you just just Google through these websites. You'll find several of them teaching Quranic Arabic. Whichever of them you feel comfortable with. There are paid courses, there are free courses, there are classroom courses, there are self-taught courses, all kinds of stuff being offered all over the world relating to Quranic Arabic. And thanks to this COVID, it played havoc with a lot of things, but the thing that it instigated, one of the things that it did inspire was that people have come up with these websites and with these apps, which besides other things, there are apps which teach the Quran, the Arabic of the Quran. I think you should, if you have that passion, then please continue, because this is something that you'll really thoroughly relish.
Dr. Khalid Zahir, one of your colleagues, has started an early morning class, which I am attending. But I am, so engrossed and I want to understand the meaning of the Quran. Believe me, Dr. It gives me so much pleasure when I'm offering my prayers in the mosque, and the Imam is reciting, and I can understand what he is saying because I've read it. I've understood the meaning of Surah Yasin and other surahs. So I would suggest to all who are listening to this to please at least memorize the meanings of those surahs which you read very often in the Quran. It will give an entire new dimension to offering prayers in either alone or in the mosque. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you very much. Ghamidi Khan, you're up next. Please go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum, sir.
Walaikum salam.
सर मैं ये पूछना चाह रही थी कि ये जो 7 चैप्टर्स बनाए गए अल्लाह ताला की तरफ से भी सूरत हुजरात में बता दिया गया। पूछना मैंने ये था कि तीसरा, चौथा, पांचवा, छठा जो है, तीसरा, चौथा, पांचवा, इनसे कहा गया, इसमें कहा गया इंजार ही है, तस्किया तत्हीर ही है, इंजार बिशारत है। तो अगर 4 चैप्टर सेम ही है तो 3 में अलग अलग टॉपिक मिल रहे हैं। जो पहला इस तरह बताया गया कि उनके लिए, क्रैश के लिए, यहूद के लिए, सॉरी, या वो मैंने नोट कर लिया। तो 7 चैप्टर्स की समझ नहीं आ रही। 4 बिल्कुल एक ही बुनियाद की बात कर रहे हैं اور تین الگ الگ بات کر رہے ہیں.
ہاں نہیں دیکھیں وہ آپ اس لیے آپ کو لگ رہا ہے کہ وہ براڈلی انہوں نے لکھا یہ ہے کہ جو یہ 3 چیپٹرز ہیں یا 4 ہیں یہ انذار و بشارت کر رہے ہیں، لیکن وہ جو انذار و بشارت کی نوعیت ہے وہ جب آپ تفصیل پڑھیں گے تو بہت فرق ہے. اس کے اندر جو تفصیلی طور پہ بات ہو رہی ہے وہ اجمالی طور پہ تو اس کو کہا جا سکتا ہے، اسے کہتے ہیں نا کہ اجمالی طور پہ، لیکن جب آپ اس کو اندر اندر الگ الگ پڑھیں گی تو اس کی تفصیلات کے اندر جو انذار کی نوعیت ہے، یعنی بعض جگہ پہ انذار تاریخ سے ہوا ہے، بعض جگہ انفس و آفاق سے ہوا ہے، بعض دفعہ عقلی مقدمات سے ہوا ہے، تو وہ اس کی نوعیت میں تبدیلی آپ دیکھیں گی. تو اس پر عنوان ہے جس میں آپ اس کو دیکھ رہی ہیں کہ اس میں اشتراک ہے. تو یہ آپ جب پڑھیں گی ایکچولی تو آپ کو نظر آئے گا کہ یہاں پہ بہت فرق ہے. پھر اس کے ساتھ ساتھ مخاطبین ہیں، جیسے آپ دیکھیے کہ جو گروپ ہے 7ویں سے لے کے دوسرے تک جب آپ پہنچیں گی، سارے کے سارے جہاں پہ جو مخاطبین ہیں وہ مشرکین عرب ہیں، کیونکہ 2/3 قرآن جو ہے وہ مکہ میں نازل ہوا اور 1/3 کے قریب مدینے میں نازل ہوا. تو جو پہلا گروپ ہے تو یہ آپ دیکھیں گے کہ اس کے اندر زیادہ تر اہل کتاب ہیں جو زیر بحث ہیں، جبکہ اور یہ دوسرے گروپ میں بھی ہیں، لیکن دوسرے گروپ میں جا کے چونکہ فیصلہ کن وہ سورہ آتی ہے جہاں پہ فیصلہ کیا جائے گا، سورہ توبہ، تو وہاں جا کے اس کا ایک لحاظ سے اختتام ہوتا ہے. لیکن 7ویں سے لے کے دوسرے گروپ تک ہر جگہ پہ آپ کو مشرکین نظر آئیں گے اور مسلمان نظر آئیں گے، لیکن ان کے اندر آپ دیکھیں گے کہ مختلف ایسپیکٹس کا اضافہ ہو رہا ہے اس انذار و بشارت میں، کہ کہیں منافقین زیر بحث آ رہے ہیں، کہیں منافقین کی کوئی خاص خصلت زیر بحث آ رہی ہے، کہیں مسلمانوں کو اندر بتایا جا رہا ہے کہ آپ کے اندر کمزوری ہے. منافقین اور ضعفاء میں تفریق کی جا رہی ہے، یعنی منافقین تو صریح ہیں نا جو اپنے اوپر سے کچھ اور ہے اندر سے کچھ اور ہے، لیکن کمزور مسلمان بھی ہیں کہ جو ان کے اندر کمزوری پائی جاتی ہے، ان کے لیے الگ ہے. تو یہ آپ اس کو صرف عنوان کے تحت دیکھ کے یہ نہ سمجھیں، اس میں اندر بہت باریک اور لطیف فرق ہیں، جب آپ پڑھیں گے آپ کے سامنے آ جائیں گے.
صحیح صحیح ٹھیک ہے سر، بہت شکریہ. میں ایک اور سوال پوچھنا چاہ رہی تھی، وہ پوچھ سکتی ہوں؟
Yes, of course, please go ahead.
وہ اس سے ریلیٹڈ تو نہیں ہے. دوسرا میں نے یہ پوچھنا تھا کہ جو اتمام حجت کے نتیجے میں انبیاء کے دور میں مطلب معاملات ہوتے ہیں لوگوں کے ساتھ جو سرکشی کرتے ہیں اختیار، ان کا معاملہ اور جو ہم لوگ ہیں ان عام جو لوگ ہیں ابھی، ان کا معاملہ کیا آخرت میں ایک ہی طریقے پر دیکھا جائے گا؟ یہ پوچھنا چاہ رہی تھی.
آخر تو دیکھیے جو معاملہ ہے وہ تو اسی بنیاد پہ ہوگا جس بنیاد پہ دنیا میں آپ نے عمل کیا ہے. تو جو رسولوں کی قوم میں ہیں ان کو دنیا میں عذاب جو ملنا تھا وہ مل گیا، وہ آخرت میں جاری رہے گا، بلکہ برزخ میں بھی وہ موجود رہے گا. ہمارے ساتھ جو معاملہ ہے وہ یہ ہے کہ ہمارا حساب ہونا ہی آخرت میں ہے، تو ہمارا معاملہ بھی آخرت میں ہوگا. تو یہ تو جو آخرت ہے اس میں تو سب کامن ہے. فرق صرف یہ ہے کہ دنیاوی عذاب انہی کو آتا ہے جو رسولوں کی اقوام ہے، اور جو برزخ میں بھی رہتا ہے. تو آپ سمجھیں کہ دنیا اور برزخ کے جو عذاب یا ان کے اندر جزا ہے وہ صرف رسولوں کی قوم کے ساتھ خاص ہے، اور اخروی عذاب جو ہے وہ سب کے لیے، یا جزا جو ہے وہ سب کے لیے ہے.
Thank you, Dr. Salim. That was it for all of the questions today. We don't have any more raised hands currently, so we'll be ending the session early, inshallah. Any concluding remarks?
So inshallah, we'll start off with our Quranic series next week on Sunday. It will be a new series. I think it will be announced in our groups. So we'll start off next Sunday, and a happy new year to all of you who are listening and are in any way participating. And may this new year bring us with a lot of happiness and a lot of contentment. We are able to come closer to God during this, and some of the blemishes that we were doing in the previous year and were not being able to make up for them, may God help us in overcoming them and making us better human beings. So inshallah, see you next Sunday.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.